Some years ago, I had an evening appointment, where I really needed to be on time. As I was driving to that appointment, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw smoke pouring out of the back of my car. I pulled over, I lifted the hood, and I learned that smoke was actually steam. But beyond that, I had no idea as to what the problem actually was. But what I did know is that I was not going to make it to that appointment where I really needed to be on time. Within 60 seconds, and without me waving my arms or anything like that, a small pickup pulled in behind my car. The Spanish-speaking driver pointed to a cracked hose that was spewing fluid onto the engine block, creating all that steam. He went to his truck, retrieved some large pruning shears, cut the hose, and resolved my crisis. Within 5 minutes, I was back on the road, and I was in for that appointment for which I really needed to be on time. Now, I want to ask you, what are the odds? I mean, not only did someone immediately pull up behind me at night, and not only could that person diagnose the problem, that Samaritan also happened to have pruning shears large enough to cut the hose. Now, anybody normally carry pruning shears with them in their car, just in case of an emergency? This angel appeared in my moment of need. A Samaritan, very likely in the United States, without proper documentation. But to match the drama of the story of the Good Samaritan, imagine that instead of a Methodist pastor, that I were a member of the Ku Klux Klan, in need of help from this Hispanic man who was very likely undocumented. That is the level of animosity that would have existed between the Jews of Jerusalem and their Samaritan neighbors. And any interpreter of this parable would make that point: the paradox of an injured person or a needy person ignored by those of his own ethnicity and religion, helped instead not by a stranger, helped by a despised enemy. And the irony is sharpened because the priest and the Levite in the parable are righteously religious. So the first lesson of this parable is that there is no religious claim that may be used in order to help us avoid acts of human compassion. Along these lines, the Apostle James wrote these words: suppose a believer needs clothes or food, and you say, well, God be with you. Stay warm and make sure you get enough to eat. If you don't provide for that person's physical needs, what kind of faith is that? In other words, what good is spirituality, belief, religion, or faith if we use it as an excuse to avoid helping someone? Now, this interpretation of the parable of the Good Samaritan is universally accepted. It is an example story inviting us to be like the Good Samaritan. And even those unfamiliar with this parable of the Good Samaritan knows that a Good Samaritan is a loving person who selflessly acts on behalf of someone who is in need. So the term Good Samaritan derives from the normal way that we interpret this parable of Jesus about performing unselfish acts. And because, and I agree absolutely with Pastor Liz, this Good Samaritan story is so well known, I suspect that many people think of it that was an actual historical event, that it is a story that happened. But it is a parable, which means that it is a fictional teaching device. And since it's a fictional teaching device, we know that parables typically have many, many layers of meaning, not just one. And that's why Jesus' parables are so powerful, because a listener can locate themselves in so many different places depending on their perspective at the time, depending on where we are intellectually or emotionally or physically or spiritually when we hear a parable, and depending on how God's Spirit is moving, it can have a different meaning than the last time we heard it. And yet, as I said, with the Good Samaritan parable, the nearly unanimous reading is that it's an invitation to emulate the Samaritan. And I think that's true. But if that's the sole lesson, then the parable doesn't really answer the lawyer's original question. The lawyer's original question is, who is my neighbor? But Jesus' parable, if we interpret it in the traditional way, answers the question, how does one prove themselves to be a neighbor? And those are two different questions. And if the aim of this passage, the aim of this parable had simply been to offer this great example of altruism and service, it would have been a much stronger lesson if the wounded man was the Samaritan, who was ignored by the priest and the Levite, but helped anyway by a common Jewish layperson. But what happens if, like we do in so many other parables, we kind of switch up our roles in the parable? What if we are not meant to identify ourselves with the Samaritan, but rather with the victim, a man who was going on a journey, accosted by bandits and ignored by the priest and the Levite? Our sympathy, well, it is with him as he lies mostly dead at the side of the road. Some of you saw The Princess Bride. Though the Samaritan shows extraordinary compassion, Jesus' final question points back to the victim. Which of these three do you think was neighbor to the man who fell in the hands of robbers? Ergo, the neighbor isn't the man who needed help, it's the one who was moved by compassion. And from this perspective, then, Jesus' message is this: a neighbor is someone who treats you more mercifully than you deserve, more mercifully than you would treat them if the roles were reversed. So the parable is asking, who among you will admit your need to be served by the person you hate most? Who will admit that they are so stuck and powerless that they need the grace of someone they loathe? Have you ever been there? I would never accept help from them in 100 years. And so this interpretation that identifies this as the victim is really trying to emphasize our utter dependence, our utter need. And then if we then change up a little bit more in the story and think of who do we most want to avoid needing any help from? And I think pretty cleverly, most of us really want to avoid needing any help from God. After all, isn't God the one we strive against, who we want to avoid needing any help from in all manner of ways? But then God comes at our darkest hour, when we can no longer cling to the illusion that we can dig ourselves out of the ditches that we are in. And so often ditches we ourselves dug. Now this makes the reading more difficult because that means we're needy. And we are so averse to the idea that we are needy. Ours is a culture of competence, which despises dependency. Americans revere the idea of rugged individualism, where we pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, right? Self-reliant and self-made, that's the ticket. And so even when we need help, we just go to the self-help section of the bookstore. Or now we go on TikTok or YouTube to see if there's a video where somebody can help us. And even as we dislike the idea of being needy, we also denigrate others who are needy, especially if they look needy. We don't make that big a fuss when corporations wrangle sweetheart deals, tax breaks, or secure public funds for their otherwise private enterprises, because successful businesses, winning teams, and celebrity CEOs are a symbol of competence in our culture. So when they get that help, we don't call it a handout. We call it stimulus. But then we castigate those who are on welfare because their neediness represents an incompetence that we detest. And our automatic assumption is that they're just lazy. You know, when we see a beggar with a sign appealing for help, how do we typically react? What is our first emotional response? Suspicion? Are they really trying to take advantage of me? Aggravation? Oh, I just don't want to deal with this today. Irritation? Avoidance? I mean, can I get through the stoplight so that I don't have to stop next to this person with the help needed sign? Like the priest and the Levite, which are roles in this parable that I can easily place myself into, I most often feel inconvenienced when a claim is made upon my compassion by a person holding a help me sign, especially on those days when benevolence is not on my to-do list. they're just exploiting my empathy. Both our reluctance to admit our own dependence and our callousness towards those who are in need indicates how resistant we can be to the idea that we need help from anyone, especially God. And there's a popular version of Christianity that suggests that all we need God for is to secure our salvation so that we are not left behind. How convenient is that? If that's all we need from God, we can then exclude God from our daily lives, the parts of our lives that aren't overtly spiritual. Now, that's a barren belief, and the best remedy for such a barren belief that I've encountered actually comes from the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. Because the first step requires an admission of powerlessness. It requires people to say, I am in need. I cannot get myself out of this ditch by myself. And then the second step is an affirmation that only a power greater than myself or ourselves can restore us, can restore our otherwise unmanageable lives. Most of us just don't want to make an admission like that. You know, many years ago, I was discussing this word needy with our children who were very young. And our 6-year-old daughter, I asked her what she thought it meant, and she said, it's like when I need a step stool, but I can't find it. And I asked, what do you do in that situation? She says, very simply, without any embarrassment whatsoever, I'd ask for help. And perhaps that's why children have a step up into the kingdom of God. Because unlike adults, a child's dependence isn't a cause for embarrassment or shame. It's just an opportunity to ask for the help that is needed. You know, friends, I really believe that God is waiting for us to lift us out of our self-dug ditches. God waits for our confession of need, for our admission that we are ready to depend on the one who can help us much more than we could ever help ourselves. And since I just said that, I just want to clarify that the phrase, God helps those who help themselves, is not something you find in the Bible. Because the Bible is not very big on self-reliance, nor self-fulfillment, nor self-help. Scripture is big on relationship, on collaboration, on interdependence, which, as it turns out, is what being a neighbor is all about.